To say that neurosis is caused by too much self is rather unsatisfying. It really doesn't sound technical in the way we'd like it to. If we were to have a theory for how neurosis comes about, we want it to be kind of fancy. We want scientific sounding words, or we want lots of studies and research and stuff like that, and experts who use highly technical vocabulary. And then we kind of think, yeah, this is believable. This is what I'm talking about, really. This is a proper scientific explanation. But it actually turns out that saying neurosis is a result of too much self isn't as dumb or simplistic as it almost inevitably sounds when we first hear it. The more we look into it, the more mind-blowing it gets, really. Whereas if we were confronted with a barrage of pseudo-scientific jargon, we might be impressed, but there certainly isn't going to be this big light bulb moment. We're not going to be blown away, really, in terms of insight. We're just going to be convinced that there is an explanation, and someone somewhere understands it, and that makes us feel good. As Jean-Paul Sartre says somewhere, he says something like that. So we really don't want to get the insight ourselves. We just want to know that experts have it all down in some way, and then we can rest easy in our beds. Now, in some ways, we can tackle this in a simplistic way. So we can look at the theory that neurosis is the result of too much self in lots of different ways, on lots of different levels of subtlety. Some are pretty simplistic or basic. So probably the most basic way of looking at this, which might be the way that we'd take it if we thought about it, would be to equate too much self with selfishness, which isn't really right at all, but we could look at it that way. So there used to be this TV program for kids called Barney the Dinosaur. And one of Barney's things that he did was he was a purple dinosaur, I think, as I recollect. He used to tell kids not to be selfish and share their toys. Now, it's very natural to want to have our toys all for ourselves. And if someone else comes along, to give them a right good smack in the head to make sure they don't manage to muscle in on our fun. But then there's this learning process good old Barney was explaining, which was that if you don't share your toys, nobody will like you, nobody will play with you, and you'll be miserable and lonely, and that's not good. So that's a good lesson. It might not seem amazing enough to spend a whole lecture going into, but it is basic, and it is basically true. And of course, if you were to stand up on a podium and give a lecture about it, people would be insulted, and they think, well, hang on, I'm not 6, I'm not 4. I know about the importance of sharing, and I share my toys. Which is all complete lies, of course, because as we grow up, we get more and more selfish, and we certainly don't share our toys. Obviously, we don't share our toys. The more toys we have, the less we want to share them, and we employ security staff and put up loads of barbed wire fences and surveillance cameras and pay for private armies or God knows what just to make sure no one comes and plays with our toys. And it doesn't make us happy. and we are lonely and sad. And so we hadn't really been listening to Barney at all, even though in our heads we think we've learned that lesson. And of course, capitalism or consumerism is all about not sharing our toys. And the better we do in this game, the more toys we have, and the less we want to share them. And that's undeniable. Who can deny that? Who sees rich people going around sharing their toys? Who sees rich people going around being happy, for that matter? And yet this is the way to live life according to capitalism or consumerism. And it's fair enough to say that we all fall for it. I mean, you only have to just look at people stampeding to buy shit in the January sales or whatever, if they are really genuine sales. People love buying shit. We do. We all do. And so that's one way of looking at how a particular mindset, the mindset that is based on acquisition and not sharing and repressing the compassionate side of our nature, creates mental ill health. And that's so obvious. We hardly need to go to the trouble of saying it, really. So that's one interpretation. You could say that the modern capitalist consumerist world is all based on greed and selfishness, and that's been said before. And people will say, yeah, that's right, that's true. But it doesn't make a damn bit of difference because we carry on doing it anyway. Nobody really takes any difference. We just feel a bit better because we've spotted the flaw in the system. And there are also subtler ways of looking at the notion of too much self being a pathology. One way would be to look at it as Jung does, which is to say that too much self in the Jungian view would be where we never really encounter anyone or anything that isn't us, so we encapsulate it in a bubble of self because we project our own hopes and fears and assumptions and ideas on everything, and all our energy goes into chasing the positive projections and running away from the negative projections, which isn't entirely Jung's language. But that's what he was getting at, or that's what he meant. That we're engaged in a private world, and this private world necessitates isolation from reality itself. And the reason it necessitates isolation from reality itself, because reality has got nothing to do with the self or us. It's not our projection. It's independent of our projections. It has nothing whatsoever to do with them. It is the other, as James Carr says, profoundly alien to us, and we don't push ourselves ever to go there. We're just content to muck around in our own private solipsistic and narcissistic bubble. And so, well, straight away, that doesn't need a lot of explanation as to why it is that living in a narcissistic bubble should be ill health. We don't have any connection with the world around us, and we don't have any connection with other people in that case when we go down that road. And we don't even have a connection with ourselves, even though it might be thought that we have a supreme connection, because the self that we're celebrating isn't ourself. It's not anything. Who we really are only manifests when we start relating to what's real. When we are solely preoccupied with our own projections, who we really are doesn't manifest itself. So these projections are just chasing themselves around in circles, really. And so we have this situation where if we go down the road of becoming more and more narcissistic, we all think that a narcissist is someone who loves themselves to the exclusion of everything else and is interested in themselves to the exclusion of everything else and is totally absorbed in themselves, obsessed with themselves, etc., etc. And in one way this is true, but in another way it isn't true, because what they're absorbed in or interested in or obsessed with or concerned with is a mind-created fiction. It's an image. It's not themselves at all. So really this is a love affair, not with oneself, but with some crappy kind of illusion, really. So expressing narcissism in that way, again, it's unnecessary to say that narcissism is a mentally unhealthy kind of a way to be in the world. And again, we would say, oh, well, we know that. Of course we know that. We're not narcissists, because we're not like the classic image of a narcissist. But in Jung's terms, we are narcissistic because we very rarely take an interest in anything outside of our own projections, our own judgments, our own thoughts, our own representation of the world. And we're content to live in that sterile little bubble. So in as much as we do that, we are narcissists. And more than that, our structure, the system we live in, the world we have created for ourselves, it socially engineers us to be narcissists. And we can't help going along with it, really, because we are molded by our environment and by the ideas and motivations that are encoded or embedded in our environment. Our environment wants us to be narcissists, so we become narcissists. And it's impossible for the capitalist consumerist way of life to exist unless we're narcissists. It just wouldn't work otherwise. And again, that's not particularly controversial. Obviously, we have to be manipulable by our needs, our whims, our desires for this and desires for that, our insecurities, as has been said very often. So we can quite legitimately say that modern life is pathological. It creates a pathological. It's a sick society, as Krishnamurti said 70 years ago. And again, people might say, oh yeah, I know that, I agree with that, but we don't do anything about it, and we carry on just the same. Society is even more narcissogenic than it ever was, like some kind of experiment that's kind of run away with itself. But it's an experiment nonetheless. That it is an experiment because something will be learned as a result of it, although it's likely to be a very, very difficult, if not to say catastrophic lesson. So that's another way of looking at the idea of too much self. And we could look into it a little bit more by just looking at this idea of what we mean when we say self in this way. Normally we use the word in a very hasty, non-contemplative way, which makes it very hard to understand this type of an argument. But what we mean by self is if we were to try and shed some light on it, it's kind of like what is called it embodies a reflexivity whereby we don't just do something, we are aware of ourselves doing it and we know that we're doing it. So there's a reflexive loop there. So we're kind of appreciating, or it's as if we're capturing the reality of what's going on by turning around and looking at ourselves doing it. So we're actually trying to grab hold of it and solidify it. Alan Watts, again writing many years ago, observed that nothing is really real unless we can take a picture of it and look at it in a picture, and that makes it real. Or perhaps if our story gets into the news and we can read about ourselves in the newspaper, then we're definitely real. So it's these representations, whether it's in a photograph or by newspapers or TV programs or social media, that make us real. And in actual fact, we can say that is this reflexive loop that creates the self. Because the self has to take a picture of itself in order to know that it is the self, and that makes it into the self. And that's illustrated very well by the way that we do use social media to create ourselves. In one way, it could be just by taking a selfie and posting it, which is a very pure expression of this principle. It's all there in the selfie, really. It's all there in selfie mode. Selfie mode is what it's all about. But there are other ways of creating the self. We don't have to take a picture of ourselves doing this or doing that or whatever the hell it is. We can also post stories about ourselves and assert our opinions or ideas and present an image of ourselves. And having presented it, which we do on social media the whole time, we create the self. So it's not enough for me to live. I have to take a picture of me living or demonstrate that I live and then have some representation of the fact that I'm living. And then that makes it reified, makes it solid for me. And then the flip side of that is that I get trapped in the reification. I get trapped in the concrete picture that I've created. So although that it's very solid, and that seems like a good thing, it's a trap. And that's a bad thing. It's a trap because I've said this shall be real. That's effectively what I'm doing. I'm making it real. I want it to be real. But once this little picture is real, then I can't get out of it because it's real. So I'm trapping myself. We are trapping ourselves by taking selfies. So here I am compulsively taking selfies of myself and trapping myself of my image of myself, which isn't myself. Well, it is myself, but it isn't who I really am, I suppose, is a clearer or better way of putting it. I'm capturing this intangible essence because I want to be sure about it. If I can check up on it and say, yeah, this is for real, this is really happening, or this is really me. But when I do capture this intangible essence, it gets abstracted from what is real, which is non-reflexive. What is real doesn't loop back on itself to check on itself to make sure it's there. And by capturing the essence, or what I thought was the essence, I end up with something else. It's kind of like a little token for the essence. That's a dead thing. It's like it stands for something real, but it isn't real itself. It's impossible. It's like hearing a songbird sing, which is the old kind of way of explaining this, and so you like it so much you catch it and put it in a little cage and put it in your bedroom so you can listen to it all the time, and the songbird's miserable and doesn't sing. Possibly it dies, and then you have to glue it to the perch like the Monty Python parrot. But still, at least you've got it and it's yours, even if it's no longer doing the thing that drew you to it in the first place. So that's a very ancient mystical idea that what we capture we kill, and selfie mode is all about capturing ourselves, and yet the urge to do so is so incredible, and we feel that we're nothing unless we can do this. So in this case, if we wanted to carry on talking about terms of mental ill health or unwellness or alienation or loneliness, lack of meaning and all the rest of it, we could say it's because we've created a self that isn't anything to do with who we really are, and we're trapped in it. So everything we do on behalf of this self and all the relationships that we create on it, using it as a basis, aren't anything to do with us. They're only to do with that, with the self-image, which doesn't exist. And the self-image might be suffering and feeling pretty rotten, in which case the mental health industries want to resuscitate the self-image and make it have a happy time or a reasonable time again, which is flogging a dead horse, obviously. It's dumb. So the problem is we've reified the self-image, and then we want to revive the reified self-image, but it can never be revived because it can never live. And yet at the same time we're so immersed in this reflexive loop, or not. There are ways in which in everyday life we live more authentically than that. So this isn't a hypothetical thing. There are many illustrations that we could use to show how we go beyond the tight self-reflexive knot. And one would be any time we do anything wholeheartedly enough and with enough passion. Because as soon as we really become passionate about something, we stop checking up on ourselves to look at ourselves doing it so we can gloat over the image of ourselves doing it and say, yes, here I am doing the thing. Because we're really interested. We're not interested in doing selfies. We're actually really, really interested. And as a result of that, we're doing whatever we're doing, but we're not looping back on ourselves. We're not checking up on ourselves. So to carry on using the selfie analogy, it's as if all of the things that I do, whether I'm giving a talk in some auditorium, or I've just finished working out in the gym, or I'm eating in some fantastic restaurant, or I've just cooked some kind of food, or all the kind of stuff we do, which doesn't really interest us by this argument. It kind of does, but only for the sake of the self. So really the interest is in taking the selfie and proving that the self exists, not so much what we're actually doing. But then when we find something that really, really does evoke passion in us, we find that we really can't be arsed wasting time watching ourselves doing it, or trying to capture an image of ourselves doing it. We stop taking selfies. So all the really interesting stuff that we do, we don't take selfies of, and we don't post up on Instagram or Facebook or anything like that. And so the curious thing then about that is that we involved in doing something but in no way is there a sense of me doing this, because the me is gone there, the self is gone. And so this is non-reflexive consciousness with no knots to get caught in. And in that non-reflexive consciousness there's freedom, because there are no knots to get caught up in. There is dizzying freedom, as Kierkegaard called it. And from the point of view of the self, the concrete self, that's very frightening, because it's lost forever in that freedom. Okay, thanks for watching.